Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this very special event for Open House 2020. We're very pleased to welcome you to the second part of our event after our collection tour. And this is the launch of the latest issue of the RMIT Design Archives Journal, which I'm not sure if you can see. I will wave in front of me here. The journal is part of our extensive research program at RMIT Design Archives. We are, in fact, a research hub, and we produce the journal. We also produce exhibitions, we host conferences, and we have PhDs associated with us and masters by coursework and other research of that nature embedded in our practices as archive professionals. And the journal is a much loved object by us, and we all take part in producing it. It's very much a collaborative effort. It started life when the archives themselves opened in 2008. It started as I think it was 8 pages or something, as a newsletter. And then a few years later, it became a journal. And then more recently, it's become a peer-reviewed journal. And I have to say, without being too boastful, that I think in terms of design, not architecture, because architecture is very well served in the research community, but in terms of Australian design history, I think it's possibly the only peer-reviewed journal in the country, something that we are quite proud of. And while we do encourage research around our collections, that's not necessarily the case, but research that is somehow associated with what we collect is what we commission or we receive from people who come up to us with ideas. Sometimes we have open issues that combine a whole range of different articles, but more recently, over the last, I don't know, perhaps 2 or 3 years, we've been having thematic issues, and some of those have been issues related to commercial art or issues related to fashion, to the Centre for Design, which was a very early example of a sustainability-led research centre. And more recently, we just launched an issue devoted to Robin Boyd, and this one is a special issue on architecture. Hence, we're launching it for Open House. Now, unfortunately, due to COVID, we have very limited physical objects, but as soon as this launch is over, Anne will post the digital version of the journal up on Issue, which you can download free. And also, well, I'm not sure actually if Issue is free. Anyway, you can download it. But it is also up on our website. It will be on our website, as are all of our other journals, and they are free to download and to have a look at. So I really do hope that after this special launch, you will take advantage of that and have a close look at the articles in the journal. Now, just the order of appearance, what we're going to do, normally when we launch a journal, we go into the active archive, the large space I was speaking about before, we throw a big party, and it's very good fun. But we're not going to do that today for obvious reasons. We're going to be much more decorous. And so what we're going to do is we thought it'd be great if we asked each of the authors to spend a couple of minutes talking about their article. And then, after I've had a few words, I will then pass on to Michael Spooner, who's lecturer in the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT. Then we'll hear from Stuart King, who's a senior lecturer in the Melbourne School of Design at the University of Melbourne. Then we'll hear from Roger Benjamin, who's Professor of Art History at the University of Sydney, followed by Peter Downton, who's Emeritus Professor in the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT. And then we've invited Stephen Banham, who's a lecturer in typography in the School of Design at RMIT, to talk about designing these journals, because he's been with us from the very beginning. And we are very proud to work with Stephen on the journal. And I think the cover of this one is particularly beautiful. They all are, but this one has really, I think, is stunning, possibly because of the content, which is one of Michael Spooner's drawings. Anyway, and then after that, we'll have Q&A. So get all your questions ready that we will answer when we've finished this, this session. So can I have the next slide, please, Simone? So just a couple of words about my article to start with. What I did here was I looked at the work that Frederick Romberg, who I spoke about before, did for the Lutheran community in Australia. And this is really interesting. It actually came about from a conference that was held up in the Melbourne School of Design at Melbourne Uni. And it was on the impact of religious communities on the development of modernism in Australia. And I was asked to talk about Romberg's work. And so I went to the archives and found 3 works that he did, which I found quite interesting. They were different buildings for different sort of Lutheran activities, but they spoke to not only the way modernism really helped, or was integral in the development of our cities and suburbs after the war, but also the way those communities were embodied and had a voice after the war. And in my case, it was the Lutheran community, which had been part of Australia since the mid-19th century. But of course, after the war, particularly with the emigres coming in from the Baltic states, the Lutheran community was greatly expanded, and they needed new facilities. So on the left, at the top left, that photograph I'd never seen before until I spoke to a Lutheran member of the Lutheran Church at St. John's in South Bank, and he sent me this photo. And what it shows is the original 1920s little Lutheran Church of St. John, and then this small addition that Frederick Romberg was commissioned to design at the back of it. And this was just before that they were about to be bulldozed to build Southgate. So all of the existing infrastructure, South Melbourne infrastructure around that has been bulldozed, and you've just got this remnant of the church there. And you can see this little modernist hall that was very much about the Lutherans trying to provide a space for their young people. They wanted to have activities that will keep the younger generation in the church. Now on the right, we have a different project. This is not the photograph on the top. The bottom perspective is Frederick Romberg's perspective for a school at Croydon for the Lutherans. It was a secondary school. It was only the second one built in Australia. The first one was in Adelaide, in South Australia. Not sure if it was Adelaide, but it was in South Australia. Now, what I found when I was doing research on this was really interesting, that, and I was talking about letters and how important they are, correspondence, because when Frederick was talking to the Lutheran communities about the possibility of getting this project from them, Robin Boyd was in America on a fellowship there. And so he was asked to go and speak to the Lutherans there and find out what the latest was happening in Lutheran design for Lutheran schools. And Boyd had been to visit the studio of the very eminent Finnish American architect Eero Saarinen. And Saarinen was designing at the time a Lutheran school, and you can see that's at the top. And what I found very interesting is that what I think Romberg took from Saarinen was this idea of using very low scale buildings spread out across a greenfield site, and both of them use vernacular typology in their development of the architectural sort of idiom that they use. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. And then the third one that I talk about in the article is this really lovely Holy Trinity Church in Canberra that the office designed, well, Frederick design for in the office. And again, this is a lovely sheet of drawings. I mean, the old drawings like this are terrific because you've got everything on them. You've got an elevation, you've got a section, and sections give you so much detail about what actually goes on in the building. And you've also got details, structural details, all on the one sheet. And then we have a photograph as well of the exterior of this church. And it was built as a little pavilion, which Grounds Romberg and Boyd was one of their favourite architectural types at the time. They did a lot of pavilion building. This was a square plan with a very broad roof. And I think, again, he's using the vernacular of the homestead in this very low scale but beautifully refined church that still exists in a somewhat battered state in Canberra. And now I'll hand over to Michael Spooner, who'll talk about his article.
Thanks, Harriet. So I guess my article really began in 2018 when I managed to get a set of keys for the second level office of the that was formerly occupied by the Melbourne architectural practice of Edmund and Corrigan. And this was located at number 46 Little Latrobe Street in a building designed by them in about 1986. And we can see a photo of it on the right here as it stood. So beyond a few sort of passing commentaries, largely from Conrad Hayman, the historian, little has been really written about the architectural characteristics of the office or the building, which the partnership occupied for more than 30 years. And also realised quite a number of their important architectural works. The photo that you see here on the right was originally used around for the book Cities of Hope, the first edition of Cities of Hope about the practice. And this was done about 1993, so it's about the time that Building 8 at RMIT was being completed by the office just down the road. I had assisted Peter Corrigan from about 2008 to 2012, and had also completed my PhD around Building 8 and around Peter Corrigan. And so to the right, to the left here, you can see a sort of window that frames a view into the library, and to the right of that is a series of photos that show the original congested, I guess, interior environment of the office, and also the library where I would meet Peter. So in part, this essay was motivated by the passing of Peter in 2016 and the donation of the practice's substantial archive to the RMIT Design Archive, the donation of Peter's library to the RMIT Library, as well as the notoriety of the office to many who had visited, who had worked there or had been a student as part of Peter Corrigan's studios at RMIT Architecture. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. So what I did, I began a sort of really to complete a detailed 3D model of the office building using documentation that I had sourced and really a bit of luck with a tape measure and a pencil. And this is what has been used to create a lot of the architectural representations that illustrate the essay. The essay draws on conversations with Maggie Edmund and those who worked in or visited the office, and it accounts for the establishment of the practice in Little Latrobe Street from 1975, prior to the construction of number 46, the purchasing of the original 1855 bakery property, number 46 from the earliest design propositions to the found and much less congested condition in 2018, along with the development of the urban refrain, and unpacks the building's relationship to the characteristic architectural and theatrical intentions of Edmund and Corrigan. This was a long-term project completed over a number of years, and that really ran alongside the design studios at RMIT Architecture that I was leading, during which time the students navigated both the building as a found artefact and explored what could be accounted for through its material heritage and their continued occupation of it. To the right here, we see a group of students outside of the building during an exhibition of their work in the office last year. And it was really the student-led projects that prompted me to pursue the digitally constructed vignettes. You can see here one on the left, and these were completed alongside Jack Murray and William Benny. These vignettes were about putting the office back into the office as an idea and really suggest the ongoing occupation and life of the building. This vignette on the left places the found building section alongside early design proposals and buildings from the canon of architecture that may have influenced the architectural character of the design, and they're really understood as models in the studio of the office. To finish, I really see this building as having a distinct personality and as really as an architectural protagonist, and the work presented in the journal demonstrates sort of my ongoing affection for it. I'd like to now hand over to Stuart King, who will be speaking about his research on Geoffrey Woodfall.
Thanks, Michael. Look, my article on Geoffrey Woodfall works with his professional archive, and it focuses on his 1969-1970 Woolnorth homestead in Tasmania. You see the homestead in this image. It's remote in Tasmanian terms. It's nestled in the dunes on the island's northwest coast. And it's an extraordinary location. When you climb the dunes behind the back of the house, you're facing the roaring 40s. It's visually remarkable. It's also an emotionally challenging landscape as a consequence of its colonial history. The construction of this homestead was rational. It was also romantically crafted and replete with custom designed fittings and furnishings, including the dining suite that you see here, which was made of Tasmanian blackwood that was harvested on the property. Woodfall was interested in ideas about expressing Australian identity in architecture, and they surface here in this building in its seemingly vernacular homestead form, in its materials and in its detailing. But it's important to note that these ideas cohere in this building in relation to family, company, and also personal histories that all intersect on this property. And this article then goes on to explore this homestead through three different lenses. So firstly, Woolnorth is a company homestead. At the time of its design, it was to be the headquarters of the Van Diemen's Land Company. Now, the Van Diemen's Land Company, which is still in existence today, was established in England in 1824, and it was responsible for European colonisation in northwest Tasmania. And then the 1960s were a pivotal moment for the company, with the appointment of its first Australian-based governor, Alan Ritchie, and also the transfer of the company's residence from England to Tasmania. And it was at this moment that this homestead was commissioned and built. Now, if we go to the second slide, in various ways, Woolnorth was also a family homestead, and indeed family connects the Woolnorth homestead to Geoffrey Woodfall's other very well-known homestead, Old Penola, which was designed and built for Peter Rymill and Judy Nee Ritchie Rymill. And one of the really fascinating things about this article is the way in which Woodfall's archive reveals the interconnections between the commissioning and the construction of these two homesteads, and also their connections back to the Ritchie family homestead of Blackwood in the Western Districts of Victoria. And so thirdly, Woolnorth sits within Geoffrey Woodfall's oeuvre, and in this article I'm particularly interested in the way in which he approached the homestead as a type, negotiating sites, histories and identities associated with the type. And those negotiations include Woodfall's own interests in both American and Australian sources of reference, both architecturally and historically. And on the screen, we have an initial design for Old Penola. It's not the design that was built. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright inspired design for the building that comes from the archive. So it's very different from what was built ultimately, but it's a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding Woodfall's design process and also the other people and their identities at stake in these buildings. So with that, I'm going to now pass over to Roger Benjamin, who's going to talk about his article.
Thank you very much. My piece, I thought I would handle the short talk today by talking a little bit about how I came to write this article, because several years ago, Harriet Edquist, editor of our journal, said to me, wouldn't it be great to do something on this studio that she was aware of, designed by the Czech emigre Alex Jelinek sometime in the 1950s or 60s, a building which she remembered seeing many years before. And I said, I'd love to, but I don't have any information. And that sort of sparked a process of investigation that took me, all three of the photographs that you see here, showing Mr. Jelinek in 1965 on the left, the interior of his studio extension to a big Victorian house on Richmond Hill on the right, and then the rear exterior below. These photos belong to the archive of Jelinek's niece, who lives in the provincial region in the north of the Czech Republic. And really only 9 months ago or so, I was able to visit there and discover these images for the first time. And then what followed was a series of investigations that allowed us to get into the house itself, which still stands and is owned by a senior Czech, as it happens, psychiatrist. The article then was elaborated using the letters that the client, who was the painter Lena Bryans, had written to her son, who happened to be living in London in 1956 when she purchased the house. So I thought you might be interested to hear of the sort of sleuthing that constitutes research in architectural history, as in art history, as I conduct it in my day job. Next slide, please. So these are drawings from the personal archive of this guy, Alex Jelinek, who was famous for a house built in Canberra in 1957, the so-called Round House in Deakin, where I had the good fortune to grow up. So it is a family connection. The issue of memory is very important. Very late in my life, I was able to meet the architect, and as a result of those meetings and interviews, his estate loaned me the archive, and you see here hitherto unpublished drawings that he made for the Lena Bryans house. Now, this was an extension for his life partner. Lena Bryans took up with young Jelinek in 1955, and they both died in the 2000s. So I just want to give you a brief sense of some of the materials that can be brought together in order to construct this piece, and I hope you enjoyed reading it. Thank you. And now I'm going to pass the baton to Peter Downton. Thank you.
This is nothing remotely as interesting looking as those images we've been seeing. I am in this article talking about something that I was actually involved in. I sort of had to unravel some history because it's a memory trick as well as an archival trick. I was very much involved in the design of an architecture course at RMIT that started in 1985. Its antecedents probably go back to the late 70s, and we were actually going through the approvals process by 84. But it was a very different course in terms of what was around at the time. I had personally gone through an architecture course at Melbourne Uni, which was totally and unutterably prescriptive. We had a choice of an essay in our fourth year of our course. Otherwise, everything else assumed that the designers of the course knew exactly what an architect would need to practice. In this case, a group of us assembled this course, and it's actually a points amassing course. So the topic areas of your study are divided along the horizontal line and cover design studios on the left, then architectural theory and related things, and then architectural technology, professional studies, history, society, culture, communications, and then it got into some requisite RMIT things, which were basically more of the same. One of the tricks that we performed was writing what were largely empty boxes. So if you look at the collection in the architectural theory column, number 2, there's 4 or 5 subjects at each of the middle levels where I wrote appropriate things to get approval, but they actually left nothing prescriptive there for anybody who was running them. So they could be used as an area in which you could do some extremely fine research, or you could cover something that was very general or challenge the students or what have you. So this made this a very different course. Very hard to get through RMIT at the time, because the early 80s, they were working very hard to progress backwards to 1952, and in the structure of courses then, it was aided by one individual with power on central RMIT. But I think what is also interesting is then what happens to such a course. This particular one, which appeared to have an awful lot of freedom, slowly but surely got more prerequisites built into it as staff thought that it was a good idea to have lead-ins to what they were wanted to talk about. It became tighter and tighter. The freedoms basically became illusionary. But there was, of course, in a design-based course, a lot of variation in studios, but there was a lot happening in the world. So this started in '85. Very little in the way of computing going on. There was a subject in the column 3 there, a 1-point subject called Introduction to Microcomputers. And by the time this was running out of energy as a course, we're looking at the early mid-90s, there was, of course, not only the internet, which had been around for quite a while, but there was the web, which made a big impact. There was a lot of very powerful software. There were very different ways of practicing architecture. So I think what I tried to look at partially in the article was the problems with prescribing a course and saying everybody needs to do this. This is requisite for your future life as a designer or a physicist or whatever, because it just varies so much. So that will do for an account of that. There is another slide, but I don't think it's worth looking at for these purposes. So I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, you've heard an extraordinary scope of viewpoints, and I guess my job as the designer of the journal is to bring this extraordinary mix of topics and thoughts, ideas into a single kind of form. I would first of all say that working on the journal is a bit like a walk through a candy shop. A candy store as a child. You're looking at endless, beautiful, delightful ideas and the way that they manifest into architecture, communication design, advertising, fashion design, absolutely all sorts of things. So it's extraordinary that you'll be working on work. You'll be looking at sort of Alex Stitt, and then going to Kral, and then going to Romberg, and then all of a sudden you'll be working with images of the Inflation nightclub from the 1980s, and then you'll be going back to Richard Beck and all this kind of thing. So you'll get this incredible range of content, which is an absolute delight. But I guess implicit in that is also my responsibility as a designer to come to this project trying to create kind of a vessel into which these disparate things can go into. So there's a certain humility involved with this. Like it's working on the journal always reminds me as a designer that I am just a tiny little blip in the continuum, which I think is a good thing for us all to realise. I would probably say from in terms of image treatment and so on, I would go back to the wonderful words of Eric Gill, the much maligned typographer and stonecutter, who said letters are things, not pictures of things. That's one of his famous quotations. And in many ways, when we're looking at objects from the archive, from this very living archive, I've always tried to make sure that all of those tattered edges and uneven bits and whatever, they're all present in the journal, because I want those objects to be seen as objects, not as mediated objects. It sort of, I guess it goes back to Harriet's intention of this archive being a living archive. So it's super important for me to that the journal really does bring that across. Because we're wanting to also catch up on time, I would just really like to finish on congratulating the RDA and particularly Harriet on seeing a project like this through to 10 volumes over many years. So I must say this journal is and going to make a really valuable contribution to the research community and to the design community. So I take my hat off to you, to be quite honest. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much.
It is a collaborative and joined effort from all of us, and I don't do it on my own, I can tell you. I couldn't do that. So we all chip in.
Now, we don't seem to have any questions. So are there any questions any of the presenters would like to ask at this stage of any of the other articles or authors?
No, there is a Q&A question on Woolnorth from Lyndon Woodfall.
Okay.
Can you see that?
No, oh, there we are. I can see it now. Okay, I'll read that out for you. Are you able to comment on the difficulties encountered in building the property, its use now, and has it got heritage protection? So that's for Woolnorth, Stuart.
Yeah, okay. Conveniently, the image on the screen is actually a conceptual drawing of the constructional system of Woolnorth. And so one of the things with the property, so on that far northwest corner of Tasmania, it was built by Stubbs Construction, who are based in Penguin on the northern coast of Tasmania, about a 2 to 3 hour drive away. And there's fairly remote access to this site. So part of the design was to create a system so that all the components could be pre-cut in Penguin and then shipped to site. And so you see an illustration of this system. It's basically a timber frame with a series of infill panels. And in the course of this research, I did actually talk to David Stubbs, who was the builder of Woolnorth, and he's, he has a great affection for this building, and he talked to me about its construction. And he also talked about some of the difficulties. And the one story that sticks in my mind is that it was specified to have timber shingles on the roof. So again, perhaps a kind of reference back to vernacular traditions. But of course, the Roaring Forties are roaring across the dunes, and as soon as they put them down, the winds lifted all the shingles off the roof of the building. Look, it is still in use today. It doesn't have I visited it at the beginning of last year. Nobody was living permanently in the house, but the owner of the company, who's a Chinese businessman, he stays in the house whenever he visits. And I believe that it's part of its history has always been to accommodate the kind of key figures of the Van Diemen's Land Company when they came to Woolnorth. Woolnorth as a property, again, because of its importance in terms of Tasmanian history, it does have a heritage listing over the property that encompasses the house. And that, I understand that that listing is currently being reviewed. So in relation to that listing, that property does have heritage protection.
Sorry, when was it actually built?
So it was designed in 1969, and it was it pretty much went straight into construction. So 1970. And
the budget or the cost?
I don't know the budget, but it was. There's a history of the Van Diemen's Land Company that has very brief reference to it that sort of indicates that it was a very expensive build. And that ultimately the Ritchie family had to kind of top up sort of company contributions to the construction of the building.
Wonderful.
Stuart, can I also ask a question about it? How much have you looked at the fairly obvious connection to Wright in, well, every image that you showed just made me think of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, so Geoffrey Woodfall, you know, he had a very strong interest in the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. He's accumulated a very large library of volumes, which is in the archive on Frank Lloyd Wright. And the article looks, a part of the article looks quite closely at Woodfall's interest in Wright, in particular in the design of Panola. And he produces this remarkable kind of Wrightian scheme that he presented to kind of Peter Rymel and Judy Rymel. And their response to it was that it would be a fabulous design if it was to be, it was all concrete and kind of cantilevered panels or cantilevered balconies. And they thought that it would have been a fabulous design if it was in the kind of, you know, the Flinders Ranges. But they understood the landscape of their site as very different. And then you can see the discussion then shifts, and Wright remains a constant, and they start to look at some of Wright's earlier work and those prairie-style houses. And when you get down into some of the conceptual sketches that Geoffrey Woodfall does as he revises the scheme, you can see that his thinking works across a series of precedents from Wright's work, which he then starts to kind of shift in terms of his own interests in, you know, in questions of Australian identity and sort of vernacular forms. And so there's this very interesting kind of to and fro between kind of Wright and his interests in, you know, a pathway to expressing Australian identity in the architecture.
I just thought I'd add, there's actually a question from earlier which we never got to, and I thought this might be relevant, sorry, to the journal. Someone asked, how can we educate members of the public about the wonderful history of buildings they just walk past every day without appreciating their stories? If anyone has any ideas that they'd like to share.
One, I'll hazard something of a beginning of an answer, and that is, it just seems to me that there is no design education in schools or anywhere else in below tertiary level. And certainly if you interview students wanting to come into an architecture course, most of them have extremely limited grasp of what is around them. A few really stand out because they do look at the buildings around them, but most of them give the excuse that they've been too busy during year 12 haven't looked at any buildings. But if you talk to somebody, e.g. an Italian, there's a lot more design education, sort of general philosophy in undergrad and, you know, school level programs. So I think that's a long project. If you were going to do something that was just of interest to people and filling it in like walks around the city or what have you, you'll still get a very limited number of people actually wanting to partake in those things. But it's got much better than it used to be.
And one more question, I think the M1, which is really for Harriet. Someone asked, can anyone submit articles to the journal or submit subjects for articles?
Good question. Yes, certainly. So I think the idea of submitting subjects is a very good one, and we are open to any suggestions that people might have. Generally, we've tended to orchestrate our own, but that's really because we haven't had a system yet of calling for papers, which every sensible sort of journal has, but we haven't quite got to that stage yet. But yes, if there's a theme that relates to our collections, that relates in some way to what we do, that you think would be terrific, by all means get in touch and we'll have a talk about it. Yep.
Thank you, Harriet. Looks like we don't have, oh, we've got one more question. Oh, it's Lyndon saying thank you. Thank you for coming, Lyndon. I think that's it. I've just put a link into the chat. The journal is now live, which you can go and download yourself and look at it on Issue. And I would like to thank everyone for coming to watch us today and all of our guests for joining us with your fascinating talks. And I've read part of the journal, but I'm going back and reading a lot more now. I'm really interested to see what everyone has written. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.